of the inspirations for me writing The Air We Breathe was a friend writing to me and saying, of course, you realize, Glenn, I could never be a believer. And just recognizing that she lives her life by all sorts of beliefs, but she doesn't think of herself in those terms. And she thinks that I've made a leap of faith and that she hasn't. And sometimes she looks at me and she thinks she's dodged a bullet. And sometimes she looks at me and she thinks that I've hit the jackpot. But I'm a different category of person because I'm a believer and she's not. You're a believer. You believe in the supernatural because of compassion, grace,
and nature, right?
Right. You believe in things that are incredibly Jesus-shaped, but you have this cognitive dissonance because you don't need to take a leap. You're already midair. You need some ground beneath your feet, and let me introduce you to Jesus. I think that's a different strategy evangelistically. Hello and welcome to Post-Christianity. My name is Glen Scrivener.
And my name is Andrew Wilson.
We've been thinking about our cultural moment of post-Christianity and looking at that in historical perspective, and we've sought the wisdom of people like Kyle Harper as he's talked to us about the first sexual revolution and that movement from pre-Christian to Christian society. We've spoken to Carl Trueman as well and thought about some of the shift from Christian to post-Christian society. We've been tracing through developments that I speak about in my book called The Air We Breathe. We've been thinking about 1776 and the remaking of the world. That's your book, Andrew. And really, we're wanting to put a kind of an intellectual map out there and saying, we are here. So we've been talking for hours about history, and now we want to land the plane a little bit and think about where are we now and where do we go from here? Yeah. So where does your mind first go to when you think, with all the weirdness of Western civilization and how it's been Christianized, in our cultural moment today, where do we first think about some applications?
Well, I love talking about this. I think this is because this is what we both do, isn't it? You want to think about, okay, so how do we share the gospel? How do we do apologetics? How do we parent kids? How do we disciple people? How do we build churches, preach the gospel? All those sorts of things. Where my mind goes, it will not surprise you to learn, is just things that I think just because it's what I focus on in my book, but I do think it can help us, is to think about the way in which, given the world becoming weirder, the way in which the church, particularly in the late 18th century, started to respond without necessarily even knowing why they were to the world as it was developing around them. And particularly, I try and draw out in the book, and I think it can help us today as well, in leaning into central Christian themes like grace, freedom, and truth. They're the three big ones I pick out. I think you see that in the very strong emphasis on the personal experience of grace. And in a previous episode with Carl Trueman, I talked about John, just alluded to John Newton and people like that, about how this very personal narrative, individual experience becomes actually part of the way that we sing hymns and experience the goodness of God now. How, the grace that saved a wretch like me. I was like this and now I'm like that. And this very real, vivid, visceral experience of grace being very increasingly central to the way that Christians told their stories. And in my book, I talk about Olaudah Equiano and Newton and others, just about how, like, wow, God did this for me. And it's this very personal experience of grace. And how important that is in a weirder world where the idea of a personal transformation is a very important story. And it has a lot of appeal, the idea, and obviously it's very biblical. Paul says, I used to be like this and now I'm like this. But that sort of very vivid, emotional, darkness to light, transforming narrative is partly, you might say, is shaped by the spirit of the age, but partly is just good contextualization, just saying, this is what God has done for me. So there's a very strong emphasis on grace. A very strong emphasis on freedom. We talked a lot about abolitionism in a previous episode. And I think that sort of seeing the idea that actually Christianity is freeing or it's nothing. Now, that doesn't mean that all that the world calls freedom is freedom. And actually what we have to do is to broaden the Christian understanding of the world's understanding of freedom from simply structural forces that might oppress you from the outside, but saying actually you need to be freed from something inside as well. Jesus saying anyone who, because that's, of course, the Judeans in John 8 are like, we're not slaves. We've never been enslaved to anybody. And he says, if you're a sinner, then you're enslaved to sin. But if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And that therefore there's a freedom narrative about redemption, not just from external forces, but internal ones. And then a strong emphasis on truth as well, which in our post-truth, we might come back to that in a few minutes. I just think that sort of very strong emphasis on the need to ground, for all that we're saying, we've sawed off the branch we're sitting on and we're trying to stay there as post-Christian society, Christian foundations, is now self-evident, let's move on, that actually a Christian appeal to truth and saying you have to be able to join the dots between what you claim to believe and what your foundations are. And if you're trying to build on a Christian foundation but you don't believe in Christian foundations anymore, you kind of got to acknowledge that, and you've got to be able to see the connections between what you believe and what you actually believe and what you claim to believe, and see that they're ultimately different.
Yes.
That's quite important as well. So I think those are sort of three categories that I like using to think through in our preaching, in our evangelism, the personal experience of the grace of God, which is increasingly important in a very works-based driven society in which status and privilege mean that people are being justified by works all the time.
Okay. Can I push back on that? And then we'll go to freedom, then we'll go to truth.
Yeah.
But is there also a danger, though, where everyone's telling their transformational story, and I wake up on one day and I might be a different identity that I might put into my Instagram bio today as opposed to yesterday? In the personal transformation kind of market, has there not been such an inflation that now, of course, there is a place for me to give my transformation story of darkness to light in Jesus, but it is also relativized by everyone's got their own story. And at that point, my testimony starts to be of less value, perhaps, because, that's what floats your boat. What floats my boat is that today I'm non-binary, and I've got my own personal transformation story. So how do you balance those things?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is inflation, which is why the story ultimately has to be about the grace of God rather than about your experience of change. But I think that the way in which Christians will typically might well be, but often will be, the way we talk about the experience of change will be the way of introducing the category of grace. But I think there is a fundamental difference, as we know, between I have undergone, this is the thing I'm trying now, this is the way I'm trying to be me, and this is both the objective appeal to something that God has done for me rather than something I'm now trying, but also this is a status or an identity that is given to me from outside myself. It is not dependent on my ability to maintain it, discover it, or believe it with sufficient passion.
Yes.
There's actually something that is external. And so I think that sort of, as a line I love, it just in the last song in Hamilton, where Eliza Hamilton, the real Eliza Hamilton probably wouldn't have asked this question, but the fictional one does, because she represents Lin Miranda and all of us who are watching it, which is, have I done enough? Will they tell my story? Is my story sufficiently compelling? Have I done enough? Which is what the transformation stories are doing. I will find identity if I have a sufficiently dramatic way of narrating this story. And if I do enough to sustain that sense of status or identity, or to justify my privilege, which is a big part of the modern narrative. Like, look at all these privileges I got. I'm happily married, and my parents loved each other, and I've got enough money, and I went to Cambridge, and all this. How do I justify that? And this is my friendship circle, partly. What does a life well lived look like in life? And all of the time we're therefore trying to justify ourselves, but it is still justification by works.
Yeah.
And the grace story is to say, no, I've also got a transformation story, but it's utterly different in shape, because it's based on the grace of God coming to me, and it isn't actually due to anything I particularly discovered or changed. My habits might be very similar today as they were yesterday, and although I think some of them hopefully will have changed, I don't look for my identity or security in those things. The grace of God has appeared. It's come to me. It's come from out beyond.
Right.
And has grounded a totally different sense of identity, and actually cut the legs out from under my attempt to justify my own privilege.
Yes.
Or to ground my own, the status battles, Will Storr's book, The Status Game, I found so helpful here. Like, that we've got rid of an honor shame culture, but replaced it with just different ways of defending status.
Yeah.
And even
fame shame culture, or
and that's what virtue signaling is online. That's what we're going. I've read this, and I understand that, and I know how to talk about this. I use the right terms for that, and it's all just basically a new middle class status game that we all play to go. If I use that phrase, you know that I'm a little bit more aware than if I'd use that one. And actually, what happens is when the grace of God comes and says, you just don't need to think that way or to try and justify yourself that way. In fact, you cannot justify. You're far worse than that story would imply you are. That you don't just need tinkering, you need death and life and the grace of God. So in a sense, yes, it's a transformation story, but it's a transformation story where the primary actor is someone other than me.
Right.
And where, therefore, you can't have it taken away from you either.
Right. But I think Christians need to be taught that. And I think we need to be taught a subversive form of the testimony, because I think too often we default to the hero's journey and I'm the hero.
Yes.
And you get people who start inventing wilderness years in their Christian story that that were never there.
It's hilarious, yes.
I was talking to
I've done it.
Yeah. I've done it. And I was talking to somebody quite recently about so, how did you come to faith? And he was, I was the most reluctant convert in the world, and I had all these years of wilderness wandering, and, interesting. And then, like, literally 5 minutes later in the conversation, he was like, oh, no, I grew up going to church all my life. And his wilderness years were really about, 8 months when he was dating a non-Christian. And his great intellectual wrestling was basically, I think he read Lee Strobel's, Case for Christianity or something, and that's what sort of But the incentives to kind of absolutely emphasize the wilderness wanderings are because we're wanting to tell a hero's journey, and I'm the hero, and I have gone down into the dark pit, but I have discovered either the intellectual credibility of Jesus, or you have the drugs and the guns and the car chases kind of testimonies and that kind of thing, because we're all trying to be the ones who go down into the valley and then we somehow make our way back up. But the frame I tell Christians to put around their testimony is, I couldn't have gotten through X without Jesus.
Yeah.
In which case, like, and X is whatever suffering, could be lockdown, could be the series of surgeries that you've gone through in the last couple of years or whatever it is, but you're in the darkness, and then the one from the outside comes.
Yeah.
And I think that's a subversive kind of testimony that we tell nowadays. Otherwise, as I said in a former episode, there are Christian testimonies that sound exactly like very worldly testimonies about transformation that happen. And I think we need to set ourselves apart, both in the shape of things. I'm in the darkness, Jesus comes and meets me. And if I've grown up in a Christian home, a perfectly good testimony is, why are you a Christian today? Oh, my parents absolutely believed in Jesus and they lived like it.
Yes.
And it showed.
Yeah.
And later on I read some books and it made sense to me. But we feel like we can't tell that kind of story because it doesn't foreground me and my spiritual journey. Well, what if your testimony is not meant to foreground you and your spiritual journey? A, it's meant to foreground Christ. And B, if it redounds to the greater glory of your family or your church community, well, that's a great testimony, And if you've got swept up in the Christian community that raised you, well, that actually is a great testimony to them rather than to me. Yeah. And so all that stuff about testimony, yes, amen, I agree to it, but I do think there's a subversively Christian
it has to foreground the grace rather than the transformation, because sometimes the grace, the transformation, that in some ways, sometimes the gift of grace meant that you were preserved from having to be the wretch like John Newton was, whatever. Now, I do think that the reason I find that the language of grace in the way it is increasingly used by 18th century believers so fascinating is because they are already being shaped by and learning how to dialogue with a world in which the individual and what happens to them is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. And in the end, your personal story is always going to be important in a culture like ours.
Yes.
But I think the way to do that in a wise way is not to foreground, I used to be this terrible, I have to now make myself as bad as John Newton in order to make the story work.
Yes.
But rather to say the grace that saved Newton and the grace saved me saved us in very different ways, but actually it's ultimately rooted outside of the self. And that's what's uniquely Christian about it.
Yes. Okay, great. So that's grace. And then freedom. I love that, that we need a much richer account of freedom that is not just freedom from, but it's kind of freedom for.
And freedom for. Yeah.
And your excellent book with Alistair Roberts, Echoes of Exodus, makes that point, that the redemption out of Egypt is, yes, you need to get Pharaoh off your back, but also there's the wilderness and you are to serve the Lord.
Golden calves and fiery snakes and all the rest. I mean, as in the story's only, it takes, you effectively out of Egypt by Exodus 15.
Yeah.
But you don't get, but actually the wilderness, it takes the rest of Exodus, the whole of the book of Numbers, a bunch of Leviticus. You think, this is actually a longer process of Israel's healing from the slavery within, in some ways, the other gods to whom they would be captive, which in many ways is the whole of the rest of the Old Testament fighting. So I think a freedom narrative is very appealing to modern people, but I think we have to make it three-dimensional rather than saying it is simply once I am free from the external forces of, whatever it was that I needed to be, I come out of prison and now I can do whatever I want. And say, no, actually you doing whatever you want is probably going to make you just as much of a slave as you being physically forced not to do certain things, because slavery is multifaceted. It's not only external. It's, in fact, the internal one is often worse.
Yeah.
And I love the Hunger Games here and I talk about this in the book. I just find it really interesting that you can be enslaved in the sense that Katniss and the people are in the districts. This is a 1984 vision of slavery. There are guns and cameras and you can't do anything without someone making you do something else. But then there's also slavery in the Brave New World sense. The people in the Capitol are also enslaved to just sort of carnal desires and, hey, let's eat all night and then vomit so we can eat again. And, the drinking sort of fatuous, banal television and, the Brave New World vision of, the bumble puppy and all this stuff. You just think some of that, it just exposes something much deeper that's wrong with us and the way that people can. Yeah, even just scrolling is, how people, you feel like if you try and say to somebody, just put away your phone or just stop consuming that sort of thing, how enslaved people are to that. And that particularly when it comes to something like sex, where the freedom narrative makes it sound like the way to be free is to just have sex with whoever you want. I think people become enslaved and often actually have far more fulfilled lives and sometimes even fulfilled sex lives by saying no to things than by saying yes to things, and just being able to be free from the thing that would enslave them to do more of the thing that they feel makes them happy. And knowing that actually happiness is a result of a freedom from internal passions and not just external ones, which is such a biblical idea. But I think we have to show, and even using freedom language to describe that process is, I think, very important in discipleship.
Yes, and we saw that with Kyle Harper talking historically about the impact of virgins
free will,
in the early church, and that actually free will was first a phrase that was used in conjunction with Christians who are exploring the fact that you can say no to this biological imperative and this very social imperative to not be a virgin. And those who said no were exercising a supernatural, superhuman kind of free will in resisting sexual urges. And so when we think of sexual freedom, we think it's the freedom to indulge our sexual passions, and a biblical and historical sense, it's the freedom to say no to those libidinous desires that are just kind of washing through the culture. So freedom, grace, and then truth. We're living in a post-truth age, though, Andrew. That's not going to go down well, is it?
Well, this is the thing. I think people, post-truth is usually, at least in our context in Britain, maybe that there's some people who are big fans of post-truth, but usually it's used with a lot of criticism. It's like post-truth is a way of describing other people's disconnection from reality, rather than a sense of, isn't it great? None of us really believe things. And most of what we call post-truth is really post-trust. I think it's more a critique of the organs of the trusted institutions and arbiters of good judgment in society of the last 100 years, whether it be a mainstream media outlet or a particular form of scientific community. These people that everyone trusted, and the church clearly, are not trusted in the same way. People say, I've lost my faith in science and progress. They say, I've lost my faith in the Holy Church, but if I ever lose my faith in you, then I think it's like a loss of trust in the people we used to trust. And I actually think post-truth is a strong point for Christians to lean into, not just because we do believe in truth and other, but in many ways we've seen this as we've done this series already and in previous episodes, that there is a very strong impulse to say these things are true, these things are false, that is lies. That actually, in response, whether it be in response to Donald Trump or response to just fake news, misinformation, people say, I want to believe in truth. I don't want what I believe to be untrue, and I certainly don't want to act like I don't care. But what the church can and should do is not just say, well, this is a different vision of truth. I think 20 years ago, lots of people were concerned. There will be, this is my truth, tell me yours, that sort of thing. But that isn't really, even though people still use the language of here's my truth, that what they really mean is this is what happened to me and you need to value that story. But they don't mean there's no such thing as truth and no one cares what it is. The reason they're telling you the story is because they think this is true and it did happen to me and you should care. And that what Christians then need to do, I think, is to see that there is within society a very strong desire to join up what they say they believe with what is in fact the case, so that the moral imperative for justice or for action to do something, particularly amongst younger people, is warranted by the way the world truly is, rather than just being, well, you happen to like campaigning on that issue, doesn't really worry me. But you start talking to young people like that, or anyone, about racial justice or about the environment or about people go, no, I don't. I'm not saying this just because it happens to be one thing I'm into. I want you to believe that this needs to be done. And that is a powerful opportunity for Christians, because in the end, that, they're sort of back to Ben Franklin and his self-evident. He's saying it isn't self-evident that these things, the reason why you believe that people are equal and that there should be justice for the poor and oppressed is because of Christian convictions about the world that ultimately are ontologically true. They are grounded in the being of God. They are grounded in the way the world is created. And if you want to sustain those convictions, and you should, you just need to find their roots in who God really is.
Yes.
And if you do what Yuval Harari does Yuval Harari, I'm getting confused. What he does in Sapiens, where he just says, oh no, this is, in the end, it's not true, but we are a post-truth species. We just got to go with it anyway.
Yeah.
People go, no, it's only if you've got a huge amount of money and privilege that you can get away with that. If you're contending against serious injustices in the world, you have to believe that this is grounded in reality. And there's a huge opportunity for Christians there to say, that instinct you have is correct, but it's grounded in a different, better story.
Yes.
That is fundamentally true.
Yes.
And this Christian story gives you foundations for what you want to believe that is far stronger than what you get if you swallowed the sort of the materialist line about the way the world is.
Yes, yeah. And maybe Athanasius is a real help in this. In the beginning of On the Incarnation, the self-same Word who made us in the beginning came to us in redemption, and that integration of grace and truth, that integration of the logos of this world, the logic of this world, who became flesh, who became embodied, and holds together these realms of nature and grace that are so kind of contested these days. And we've mentioned on a previous episode that it seems like the Christianization of culture has left us with beliefs in compassion and equality and human rights and progress and the secular, none of which are derivable from nature, none of which are none of which can be logically demonstrated, but they are beliefs, they are belief commitments, and in that sense, they are supernatural. So we're very sure about that. We're not so sure about nature and biology, and if someone starts to make a claim about what is actually natural, that's the most contested claim of all. How dare you say what is natural? And people are very suspicious of those sorts of claims. So we have this sort of sense of some kind of grace, supernatural kind of stuff and beliefs and dogma, and we have the realm of the natural. And then you get trad types who are sick of trans ideology, let's say, and it's the reassertion of nature, and it's just and that can get pretty ugly.
The manosphere,
right? That can get very ugly. And so you just get nature, or you just get grace, in which biology means absolutely nothing, and society and family bonds don't really mean anything. What really what really counts is your internal sense of your own identity, and that's just sort of all grace. And here comes Athanasius reflecting on John chapter 1, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and this sense of the supernatural and the natural together in Christ. And that might sound like really esoteric, but I was just really encouraged that this Easter, Mary Harrington, who's written a new book called Feminism Against Progress, is pressing into all these issues about nature and grace. And she's finding herself in some really interesting places and with some really interesting allies in terms of doing, writing for First Things and finding herself, doing book launches with, Christian organizations all around her. And she wrote a thing at Easter about, the great hope for the West seems to be this thing where the Word became flesh. That there is a place where this stuff coheres and consists, and it's grounded. And because we don't want to get rid of grace, we don't want to get rid of compassion and equality and all these great things. We don't want to descend into the manosphere. But we also want to we also want to honor biological reality and our nature, and people have a nature, don't they? And there's such a thing as human. We can't just, we can't just go towards being post-human, can we? Where are we going to go if we're going to unite these two things together? And Mary Harrington is saying, well, I guess kind of Jesus, maybe. And that'll be interesting to see where that journey ends.
Oh man, it really will. I did some work in the book on a very unknown late 18th century figure called Johann Georg Hamann, who's a German philosopher who does a lot of that and in a completely different register. But again, is talking about the centrality of the incarnation for really thinking about Christian truth and a Christian account of grace. And he's really the first person to give like what he calls a meta-critique of the Enlightenment. He's a friend of Kant's. He's Hegel and Kierkegaard and all these guys think he's a genius, the brightest man who ever lived, along with Socrates. They just give him these crazy epithets of, and of course in the English-speaking world, almost no one's heard of him.
I've never heard of him.
But he has this extraordinary conversion experience reading the Bible, and he gets saved while reading, I think it's Deuteronomy 5 or something, really odd text. Really you're the only guy ever getting saved reading that. Has this extraordinary experience, reads the Bible and writes a commentary on it in the first 3 months of his Christian life, and then basically undertakes this hugely intellectually impressive kind of broadside against Enlightenment thinking and its separation of ultimately what he thinks of as word and flesh. You've basically separated out the ideal from the real, and your problem is really that you haven't reckoned with the incarnation. He talks a lot about language and says that every time we have a conversation, we combine ideas and the real. You and I are talking now because molecules are moving and this, but they're also expressing abstract ideas. And if you just thought about that, you'd say the reason why words do that is because the word does that. And in Christ, word and flesh are united. So we're not Gnostics and we're not ultimately idealists or realists. We do both together every time we have a conversation, and we see both united in Jesus. And that actually that's the sort of account of truth that what the modern world is trying to do, and in Harman's day and in ours in many ways, is to sort of keep the world of the bodily and the real distinct from the world of the ideal and the pure. And that actually, as soon as you have an incarnate Christ, you've just got these two worlds come together, which, back to the thing about sex and masculinity and femininity, is to say, nature and grace are, in that sense, made perfect in Jesus. And the incarnation is the sort of the focal point from which theological inquiry needs to flow. And Harman's just a genius because he's able to see that.
Yeah.
Lightheart has this lovely line on him. He says, it takes a prophet to contribute to debates 200 years before they start. And Harman is like that. But I think that is, again, in a world that's sort of wanting to wrestle with the grace-nature distinction as you've laid it out, and even post-truth, that the incarnation is really the center point. And that's why I like what you said about Athanasius. I just think, that's where we have to begin. And not just in the abstract register of thought like this, but actually just in ordinary conversations with ordinary people.
Because they're living with this cognitive dissonance that they believe in compassion and equality and consent and enlightenment, science, freedom and progress, but we are clever chimps, essentially, and we are the product of a brutal evolutionary history, and we're clinging to an insignificant rock hurtling through a meaningless universe towards eternal extinction, and things are going to get better. Okay, well, where does this progress thing and this natural reality thing come together? Well, in Jesus. And I think theologically that works. I think historically that is how it happens. And I think existentially people start to see those things uniting when they come to Jesus.
Yeah. So can you talk about, you talk a lot, and I like it, about joining dots and helping people see the connections between, which I know is what you've just done in that way, which is really helpful of, this is the material story you're told. This is the ideal story you're told. They don't actually make sense together unless you bring the two together in Christ. Can you give examples, though, of how you do that in, if you like, ordinary day-to-day evangelism? Your neighbors, your kids, your school, people at the school gate, ordinary life. You do this a lot.
Well, let me first of all tell you a story that there's no skill involved with the evangelist here. But I think in this cultural moment, there are certain fish that are jumping into the boat, whatever the fisherman does. And so a guy at the school gate just said to me the other day, I was talking about the king's coronation, and we were having a picnic at church, and he's very welcome to that. And he says, I've been thinking about coming to church for a while now. And I said, why? He said, Well, it just seems to me like Christianity has absolutely built the modern world, and I don't know a single thing about it. And I was like, well, church would be exactly the right place for you, you know. And sadly, he didn't come to that. But you know, we're still friends, and we're on that journey. But he is representative of a lot of people who are in this cultural moment, who are kind of waking up to the fact that we are not these neutral people who just happen to be Westerners in a totally secular sense, but that we are the heirs of a Christian heritage, and to be unaware of our origins is to be barbarian to some degree. Yeah. So this guy, emblematic of, there was another guy I saw at a church I was preaching at in another part of the country, and he just came up to me afterwards and he said, "Thank you for the air we breathe. It was given to me by a guy I met in the queue for the Queen's, like seeing the Queen lying in state." And so two very royal examples here. But he had 12 hours to wait in the queue to see the Queen lying in state, and he happened to be right next to a church pastor who was also in Sussex. But
who had a copy of your book?
Who had read my book and was just having this conversation with this other guy, and just got into a conversation about why are we here really, and like what is this connecting us with? And I think certainly in the UK there are a lot of people who, through the death of the Queen and the coronation of King Charles III, are thinking a lot about the religious heritage of this country. And after 12 hours in the queue with this guy, my friend then sent him a copy of The Air We Breathe. And at the end of The Air We Breathe, it just says, "Why don't you read the Gospels?" And he read the Gospels and said, "Right, I'm a Christian now," and started going to church. And so there's a cultural moment that's happening among some people. I mean, the rest is history is, you know, hands down the biggest history podcast, you know, around the world, and it's one of the most popular podcasts on Apple Podcasts. And you know, Tom Holland is sort of pushing that thesis, and there are a lot of people who are at least awakened to the fact that, oh gosh, if I'm a lot more Christian than I thought, I better understand a little bit more about this. Yeah. So there's that, and then you know, the other day I was on a plane journey, and a guy I was with works for a human rights charity. Okay, and so just pressing into that. No, you know, do you ever wonder, you know, where they're from, and if we're highly evolved apes, why does that mean we have human rights? He's like, I hadn't thought about that. It's like we had a very long conversation on that plane flight. You know, gave him The Air We Breathe, and we've been in touch, you know, since then. And so there are ways of pressing into this. But you know, even with my next door neighbor is my next door neighbor doesn't have GCSEs. He's not a human rights lawyer, right? You know, he's not thinking in these categories at all. But we were just on the porch together. We share a porch on our street, and he showed me this Facebook, you know, video of one of these beautiful moments that you see every now and again, where for instance, someone profoundly autistic, for instance, is brought onto a basketball team, and you know, they get, you know, handed the basketball, and you know, they shoot and they miss, but the opposition like hand them the ball back, and he shoots and he misses again. They hand him back the third time, and he shoots, and then the roof goes off in the gymnasium, and like the goosebumps that are on, and I was like, what do you think? Why do you think we react like that? And he said, oh, it's just beautiful. But well, why? What is it? And we just ended up having this very long conversation about there's something supernatural about that. Yes. Because the natural thing is, well, this guy would not make the cut. Yeah. He's, you know, why is he on the court? Naturally speaking, this is bonkers. And you know, his friend, the opposition is you know, handing him the ball. But this is supernatural. This is grace. This is the inversion. And we started having a conversation around the fact that natural life is the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest. The Jesus story is it's the sacrifice of the fittest, Christ, for the survival of we the weakest, so that we can not just survive but thrive and pass on this compassion to others. And I think the reason why you've got goosebumps while you watch that is that you are in touch with something very Jesus-y, very and it is supernatural. You might not think you believe in the supernatural, and as it turns out, he did believe in the supernatural. But I was like, the shape of what is supernatural there is incredibly Jesus-like, and we got on to talk about Jesus, and away we go, and he's wanted to get baptized, and he's coming to church, and it's
praise God
for that. And the other day he shows me his phone. I was like, what's that? He said, I think it's a poem. And I was looking at it. I think it's a song. And then he was like, are you musical? I was like, oh, yeah, let's go in. Like, picked up the guitar and we started. He has written now nearly 50 songs in the last 3 months as he's getting excited about Jesus. But so just to give you an example of there are fish that jump into the boat because of the cultural moment that we're in. And there are people who are interested in the big ideas, like the human rights lawyer. And then there are just people who show you a meme on Facebook. Yeah. But I think all of them are testifying to the post-Christian moment that we're in, I think.
Yeah, they are. And it's wonderful because actually in all three of those stories, I think a very early episode in this series, we talked about the fact that it's much more, it can feel much more compelling to say to somebody, here's what you believe and here's why you're right, than here's what you believe and here's why you're wrong. And obviously there's, in all of us, including you and me, there's some things we believe are right and some are wrong. But it's such a wonderfully evangelistic offer. And similarly, we were obviously recording this soon after the King's coronation. We watched it with a group of friends of ours who aren't believers. But it's just fascinating how you just, you can explain, you're just giving commentary on things that other people experience, and saying, here's a way of thinking about that feeling or that institution or that ceremony or just weddings, funerals. I mean, as a pastor, I just find there's such, the gap between heaven and earth seems to become thinner. Births, deaths, and marriages, as the church has always done. There's something about giving birth to a person or seeing a newborn baby. There's something about committing a person's body to the deep or into the ground or into the flames or whatever it is. But that just makes that, and something about marriage as well, which just is, of course, it images Christ in the church, as we all know. But it also just seems to make the gap between, again, the ideal and the real, or like the word and the flesh. It just seems to the gap gets smaller. People, I'm not quite calling it an incarnation, but you know what I mean. It makes people seem like, oh yes, this paradigm we live with, in which there is the world of things that actually happen. I eat, I sleep, I have sex, whatever I may be, and then there's this world of things I believe and ideas and mystical. Right. It just they seem to become collapsed into one another for a moment, and people go, hang on a second, it's the same world. Like, it's as if that we really are meant to have those realms integrated.
Yes.
And the value and fact are one and the same thing. And incarnation. And you just, it's wonderful. So you're able to comment and say, do you know what? That touches, that's a witness in your spirit to the fact that there is something very, now obviously not very significant taking place. Not every nation has quite the coronational pageantry that we have just had in the last week. And obviously many weeks we don't either. But there are and you look for them, there are so many ceremonies, liturgies, expressions in popular culture.
Yes.
As you just said, one of those things, but was just a thing about an autistic kid throwing a basketball. So it's not that they don't have to be massive moments of national pageantry to work. But you're providing an explanation for a resonance that exists in the human soul that's very fundamental. Yeah, I found that very fruitful.
You're awakening them to the fact that they are believers. Like one of the inspirations for me writing The Air We Breathe was a friend writing to me and saying, of course you realize, Glenn, I could never be a believer, and just recognizing that she lives her life by all sorts of beliefs, but she doesn't think of herself in those terms, and she thinks that I've made a leap of faith and that she hasn't, as though she lives like at ground level, navigating her life via reason and evidence, which nobody does. Yeah. We treat one another as though they are individuals with rights.
Or if you don't have beliefs that can't be grounded in something like that, then you become like what Carl Truman a few episodes ago was calling it, like you become a psychopath. You're going, if you actually only acted on the evidence you have of the strong eat the weak, right, you're not a pleasant person in the slightest. No one wants to be that guy. So of course So of course you're a believer.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
And that doesn't mean that she's a believer in Jesus, and she needs to come to know. But for so many people, they just don't think in that category, and they think that there are people of faith like me, and I've managed to sort of drum up enough spiritual energy. I've got the force coursing through my vein. Midi-chlorians are in my blood, or whatever it is. And sometimes, she looks at me and she thinks she's dodged a bullet, and sometimes she looks at me and she thinks that I've hit the jackpot. But I'm a different category of person because I'm a believer and she's not. You're a believer. You believe in the supernatural because of compassion, grace,
and nature, right?
Right. You believe in things that are incredibly Jesus-shaped, but you have this cognitive dissonance because you don't need to take a leap. You're already midair. You need some ground beneath your feet, and let me introduce you to Jesus. I think that's a different strategy evangelistically. Yeah.
And I think it works in preaching as well. So this is obviously both of us are preachers, and I'm pastor of a church. But I think you can my guess would be that a number of the listeners to this podcast are preachers as well. And actually, I just find myself continually saying, "Oh, that's where you get this. That's where this idea. That's where you get that from." Mm. So you're in almost any book of them. I'm in Hosea at the moment, and it's just amazing. Even there, the number of times you can say, "Oh, that idea that is." I mean, even in our culture today, mercy is better than sacrifice, or whatever. Things like you might not have heard that phrase, but actually, the idea that you'd say the essence, surely, of religion is that you're showing kindness to the poor rather than that you're offering animal sacrifices is a very strange idea. But look, here's where it comes from. And you're just continually going back to these things. And it is so helpful as a preacher to be able to say, I'm not just looking here for things that Christians need to understand and to be able to live better. But in every text, I've got things that have shaped the world in which unbelievers live.
Yes.
So that, and in our church, we do surveys. We know like 10% of the people who come to our church are not actually Christians or wouldn't say they were. And that's quite a large percentage of people that I then feel like every time I'm open
for a non-conformist church, it is.
Yeah,
in an
Anglican church, they might think they are Christians and they aren't. So that's a very different problem.
The 90-10 is.
Yeah. But so you realise actually I'm in dialogue here with people who are aware that there are things about Christianity they don't believe, but there are many things in Scripture in almost every time I get up and read the Bible that are providing foundations for things.
Yes.
And this is back to your thing about joining the dots between things you believe and things that the reasons why you should believe them, but you might not have seen the connections. And it's so helpful. So I think it works in public preaching as well as ordinary evangelism.
Yeah. And what's helped my preaching more generally is to see the Scriptures as what John Calvin called them, spectacles through which you see life. You see God and you see the world in a different light through the spectacles of the Scriptures, so that your vision doesn't terminate upon the text, but through the text you are interpreting God and the world. Now take that to these issues, and if you really recognize that this world has been built by this book, then you look at the problems of this world, and you see that yes, the Scriptures have an answer to them, but the Scriptures have formed the very issues that we're dealing with in the culture. So the other day I was preaching on 1 Corinthians 12 and one body, many parts, and I think before I thought about the air we breathe type stuff, I think I just would have preached that normally as this is about church, and it is, right? But now I begin with, how do you figure out diversity, inclusion, and equality? Such a conundrum, isn't it? And everyone's leaning in at that point, right? Because the reason why we've even attempted to have diverse communities of equals who are all included, the only reason we've attempted this is because of 1 Corinthians 12 and Galatians 3. And, the Scriptures have given us the problem. And, we have twisted and perverted and detached ourselves from the scriptural truths that are there, and we're faced with the problems of this world. But in returning to the original, there is just such a resonance with people. And so I think you preach 1 Corinthians 12 in a different way. That doesn't mean that the point of 1 Corinthians 12 is how you run your DIE, in the workplace. But it certainly does resonate. We always call it
DEI because we're worried about DIE, the possible acronym problems. But yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, I can't remember, is it Keller that says you need to say yes, but no, but yes? Or have I got that from someone else? I don't remember who it is. It sounds like the kind of thing he'd do.
Yeah.
But I found, again, preaching and personal discussion is just, it's harder to do in personal discussion because it's spontaneous. But the idea that you're saying, and it's great, what you just said is a great example, that you see something in the world and you say, yes, I want to affirm the desire for that thing.
Right.
But no, that's not ultimately the way to get it. And the reasons are there's an inconsistency there with the way you're ultimately seeing the world. Right. But yes, in that if you come to Christ and you see it through the lens of Scripture, you get what you wanted, but you
Yes.
don't get it. You actually get it better than you would have if you got it the other way.
Yeah.
And that sort of
Yeah.
yes, but no, but yes.
And that's exactly what I did. Because
Yeah.
I kind of said, we who are baptized into Christ are baptized into one body. And I was like, you know what we don't get about diversity, inclusion, and equality is on the basis of saying sorry, on the basis of actually confessing to sin. And that's the democratizing thing.
Yes.
So that it's not my
Oh, that's
identity
really good.
that I bring to the table. Because the problem with DIE without baptism, without Christ,
He's like, come as me, you've got to accept everything
You've got
about
to accept
me.
everything about me. And then I did this illustration about Christmas. Everyone's welcome at our Christmas, but our Christmas has a shape to it, And if you want to do Christmas your way, I want to do Christmas my way, he wants to do Christmas his way, it's going to be an absolute, pandemonium and chaos. And we are baptized into Jesus. And I said, you got to come through Sorry River before you get to beginning end land. And that's the shape. So it was very much a yes, no, and yes, because I guess it's a gospel, law, gospel kind of thing, and I think Keller very helpfully gets us to see that law and gospel, the first part of a law kind of proclamation in a law and gospel sweep is to say about the goodness of the law, right? There's something really good about this value, and we don't fulfill it. Yeah. And in Christ, he does it for us, and now we can in him. And so gospel, law, gospel is that shape. And so yes and no and yes, that would make a lot of sense. But yeah.
And that is, So I think that we've talked a bit about evangelism in ordinary life. We talked a bit about preaching. We talked a bit about the conceptual frame behind it. Any just final things from you, do you think, because I think you've done well particularly over the last few years, you've helped me certainly at challenging the church where needed on thinking about our response to just about how we have responded and where we've not done well as the church in a post-Christian moment. Anything to kind of speak into that and just areas where you think ecclesially or like as the corporate family of God, where you need to go, these are some things, just, I was going to say easy wins, that's probably the crass way of saying it, but things that we need to make sure, in addition to this sort of the more apologetic, ideally back and forth, and in addition also to some of the things we talked about with Carl Trueman about embodiment, hospitality, friendship, other things you just think these are areas where I just think we need to get the church right to help us in a post-Christian moment.
Well, I think Keep Sunday Special is a really interesting phrase that used to, in the United Kingdom, be the slogan for a movement to alter or to maintain Sunday trading laws. Yeah. And so, in the UK, it's still the case that Sunday trading laws are different to the rest of the week. But it used to be that pretty much most shops were shut on a Sunday, and there was a great movement that was spearheaded by Christians to say, let's keep Sunday special. And I'm really interested in that phrase because I was thinking the other day about what we need in our cultural moment as the church. I think we need to keep Sunday special, but I don't think in terms of let's worry about Sunday trading laws, and maybe you think it's a justice issue to campaign for better Sunday trading laws, and maybe you think an always-on society is no good for the workers in Tesco's and the supermarkets. Great, okay. So there is a case to be made for making that argument in the public square. But as the public square and the church become more and more different, it's a threat to us. It's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to be really, really weird. And, I finished my book by talking about, the acronym WEIRD. And I kind of say, well, just by virtue of being a Westerner, you're weird in that Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic sense. The church is called to be properly weird. Not just to believe in equality in an abstract sense, but what does equality in our church look like? What does compassion look like in our church and our mercy ministries and that sort of thing? And so let's kind of be properly weird in our church, and let's make 52 mini Christmases, and we don't have to burn ourselves out, going to great expense about it, but let's make these 52 oases in the hurly-burly of everyday life in which there are no boundaries, there are no thick lines anymore. We don't stop something and then start it again. Well, the church can and the church should, and let us really Sabbath well together on a Sunday and make it something that our families just love to be at. And then that 10% who come to your church, they feel that sense of freedom, yes. They feel that sense of grace, yes. They feel that sense of truth, yes. And they feel that sense of rest. Here is a place that resists the conveyor belt, towards productivity and pragmatism, and is able to rest together as family. And I think if we can kind of capture that in our local churches, I think that's so attractive in our modern day.
Yeah, that's well said.
So we've thought about preaching and evangelism and church life. What about family, Andrew?
Yeah, I think the same is true. We have to think through parenting in a post-Christian context. And what I found encouraging, actually, I think the hardest age probably to parent was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when suddenly issues that you didn't talk to your children about age 6 or 7 come up when the child is 12 or 13 and you realize, I haven't talked to them about this yet. Now, that was hard, and I feel for those brothers and sisters who were in that position. I think the nice thing about being where we are now in a very explicitly post-Christian way is that it wasn't nice, but my 5-year-old made fun of me for he said, you're non-binary or something. I can't remember. He'd heard it at school at the age of 5, and I think, okay, we're now going to have that conversation a lot earlier than we did. That's an example in sexual ethics, but actually, generally, I think the anthropology and value system of a post-Christian society that is very explicitly teaching children, at least in my case, they're in state schools. I know that may not be the story for everybody, but it is in Britain, it's very common. But it means actually I've got the opportunity to talk much younger than I did with my 14-year-old, and he's been fine as well. And I just think that's sort of leading into, rather than leaning away from, the very sticky areas where you say, well, actually, this is a really good feature of what's being taught, and we really like that. That's not true at all, is it? But this bit comes from the Bible. That bit there, this bit here, that's not right there, is it? But actually you get to do that when, in many ways, younger, because the issues are being raised much younger in the form of the catechesis, and that is coming along to kids. So what you have to develop is, I think I can't remember where the term comes from, but the concept of counter-catechesis, where you're saying every catechism is designed to try and respond to an error in thinking. In the Protestant Reformation, it was Catholicism. But today, it might be the ethics that you're being catechized into at school and on all sorts of issues, particularly in sort of sexual ethics. And so you get to do counter-catechesis with a 6 or 7-year-old. And that, I think, is probably a great opportunity in terms of discipleship to say, we can initiate these things because you are being asked about this. You're not cringeworthy yet because you're so young. You want to talk about it with me, and it's a good opportunity. So I think there's so many ways in which living in a post-Christian moment means we need to think creatively about how we lean towards the areas of conflict and difference, affirm what's good. And again, it's yes, but no, but yes in the context of parenting.
Right. And to do so intentionally in a way that we weren't forced to be intentional about that aspect of our parenting before now. But
not at all.
The conflict makes us think more intensely, more Christianly. Well, Andrew, we have covered a lot of ground over the course of this podcast, and we really thank you guys for joining us over the course of these podcasts. We'd really love for you to spread the word about them, so please do share on social media and get the word out. Post Christianity is a podcast of the Keller Center, which is a ministry of the Gospel Coalition. Thank you very much for joining us, and Andrew, thanks so much.
Thanks, Glen.